Hello everyone, my name is Tan Chicho. My group is going to present on Karl Marx's theory of history. First, let's see what theory of history means. It is an explanation from Karl Marx of why and how human society change over time. Theory of history have three questions. What drives change? Is it people, ideas, technology, or God? And who control the direction? Is it king or the ruling class? For Marx, history is not controlled by kings or God. It is controlled by the class that who own the factories, land, and machines. So, I will continue by introduce who is Marx. Karl Marx was born in 1818. He was a philosopher, a German philosopher, economist, and a revolutionary. He studied law, history, and philosophy at universities. Before Marx, people explain history in three main ways. First, great leaders, which is referred to the kings and general drive history. If a kingdom rose or fell, it was because of the genius or failure of its ruler. Second, religious destiny, which means God's divine plan drives history. For example, events happen because God willed them. Third was the view of the German philosopher George Hegel, which is changing ideas and spirit. For Hegel, change happens when one idea clashes with its opposite and a new idea emerges. However, Marx disagreed with all of three main ways. To say, look at the material conditions. So why did Marx reject this explanation? Because he looked at the world around him. Let's see what Marx had experienced. Marx lived during the Industrial Revolution in England. He saw factory workers, including young children, laboring in dangerous conditions. He also saw extreme poverty, disease, and early death. He also witnessed the gap between rich and poor and experienced extreme poverty of himself. Let's see what is the experience of Marx. The university positions were close to him because of his radicalism, and he got exiled from Germany. After that, he went to Paris, and then he got exiled again to London. Three of his children were died in the infancy, and he lived in the extreme poverty and tormented by illness. He spent years in the British Museum reading room writing his Das Kapital. After experiencing all of these suffers, he asked himself, do the old explanations, the great leaders, divine plan, or even the evolution of ideas actually explain this suffering? Marx's answer is no. He believed these old explanations served the ruling class by making poverty seem very natural and unavoidable. And after that, Marx also realized that the people who benefit from suffering are the one who is writing the explanation of history. And then Marx says, don't look at kings, don't look at God, and don't look at the abstract ideas. Just look at the material conditions, which means look at who owns the factories, who work on the land, and who gets the profit. How do people actually produce food, shelter, and survival? There were three thinkers who will influence the Marx thinking, and they will be introduced by my teammate.
Hello everyone, my name is Harnita Palamuga and my metric number is 305802. Today I will present the topic Fibonacci and Marx's adoptions of materialism. Before Marx became one of the most influential thinkers in history, he was actually inspired by Ludwig Fibonacci. Ludwig Fibonacci argued that humans created the idea of God, where Marx agreed with this materialist idea, but he also explained society and the economy. Let me explain how these transitions happened. First and foremost, Ludwig Fibonacci is who? He was a German philosopher who strongly influenced Karl Marx. He developed the ideas of philosophical materialism, which state the reality should be understood through the material world and human experience rather than through spiritual or religion's belief. Fieberwatch also reject the idea and argue that human sense and real-life experience are the basics of knowledge. One of his important ideas was about religion. He believed that human creates the idea of God, not the other way around. In other words, we can say that religion is a reflection of human hopes, fears, and needs. However, Fieberwatch focused mainly on religions and did not explain how society and the economics shapes human's life. Now that we have seen Fieberwatch's main ideas, let us now focus on how Karl Marx adapted and expanded them. Marx agreed with Fieberwatch that ideas come from material reality rather than from spiritual or abstract forces. In other words, human thinking is shaped by real-life conditions, where Marx also shared a critical view of religions. He famously described religion as an opium of the people, which this means religion can comfort people, but it can also distract them from the real social and economics problem they face. However, Marx strongly believed that Fieberwatch's theory was incomplete because it was focused only on religion. Marx extended materialism to explain society, history, politics, laws, and economics. According to Marx, the way people produce basic needs such as foods, clothing, shelter determines their ideas, religions, laws, and political institutions. In simple terms, the economic system forms the foundations of society. This became the basic of Marx's theory of historical materialism, which also explained that changes in economic conditions leads to changes in society and history. These are the basics theories of Marx's theory. Now, we have understood both Ludwig Fieberwatch and Marx's theory. This slide basically summarizes the key difference between their ideas. First, Fieberwatch focused mainly on religions, where he argued that God is a human projection and that religions reflects human needs and emotions. In contrast, Marx applied materialism to society and the economics. He also believed that the economic system is a foundation of society and shapes ideas, laws, politics, and religions. Second, Fieberwatch did not explain class relations or how economic structures affect social changes, but Marx, however, introduced the concept of historical materialism. He argued that history develops through class struggle, especially between capitalists and workers. Finally, Fieberwatch was mainly concerned with understanding human consequence, where Marx emphasized practical actions and revolutions social changes. In a short way, Fieberwatch provides the philosophical foundations and where Marx transferred it into a broader theory that explains how economic conditions shape the society and history. That's all from me. Thank you.
Hi everyone, today I will explain Hegel dialectical philosophy and how Karl Marx transformed it into what is called dialectical materialism. First, let us look at Hegel. Just Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German idealist philosopher who lived from 1770 until 1831. Hegel believed that history and society does not move randomly. Instead, history developed through a rational process. One of Hegel's most important ideas is called the dialectical process. According to Hegel, progress happens when ideas conflict with each other and eventually produce a better idea. This process has three stages. The first one is thesis, which is the original idea or system. Second one is antithesis, which is the opposing idea. And finally, synthesis, which is the new and improved idea formed from solving the conflict. For example, traditional monarchy can be seen as thesis, then people begin demanding freedom and right, which is become the antithesis. From this conflict, constitutional government emerged as the synthesis. For Hegel, this process happened mainly in the realm of idea, consciousness, and spirit, which he called G's. He believed human history is the gradual development of freedom and human consciousness. This is why Hegel famously said, "What is rational is real and what is real is rational." So, in short, Hegel believed that ideas are the main force that drive historical change. Now, let us focus more closely on Hegel's dialectical process. The dialectic begins with a thesis, meaning an existing system or idea. However, every system contains weakness or contradictions. Because of this contradiction, an opposing force or antithesis emerges. Conflict then occurs between the thesis and antithesis. Eventually, this conflict is resolved through a synthesis, which creates a new and higher stage of development. The synthesis later becomes a new thesis, and the cycle continues again. According to Hegel, this is how history continually progresses. For Hegel, the important point is that progress comes from contradiction and conflicts between ideas. This process influenced many later thinkers, especially Karl Marx. However, Marx believed Hegel's theory was incomplete because it focused too much on ideas rather than real social conditions. Next, we move to Karl Marx and his criticism of Hegel. Karl Marx agreed with Hegel's dialectical method, but he disagreed with Hegel's starting point. Marx argued that Hegel turned reality upside down. Hegel believed ideas shape society, but Marx believed material conditions shape ideas. This is what Marx meant by inverting Hegel. According to Marx, history is not mainly driven by consciousness or spirit. Instead, history is driven by economic system, production, social class relations, and class struggles. This theory is called dialectical materialism. Marx believed the economy, which he called the base, shaped society, politics, religions, law, and culture, which he called the superstructure. Another important idea in Marxism is class struggle. Marx said history is the history of conflict between social class with opposing interests. For example, the ruling class want to maintain power and profit, while the working class want better condition and equality. When contradiction within society become too severe, social change or revolution happen, creating a new system. So, unlike Hegel, Marx believed real change begins from material life and economic condition, not from idea alone. This slide shows how Marx applied dialectical materialism to historical development. The first stage is the thesis, which is feudalism. Under feudalism, lords owned the land and means of production, serfs worked on the land, and the society was highly hierarchical. However, contradictions developed within feudal society. As trade and industry expand, a new merchant class called the bourgeoisie become richer and more powerful. This became the antithesis. The bourgeoisie challenged feudal restriction and demand freedom for trade, private property right, and political influence. As conflict intensified, revolutionary change occurred. Eventually, feudalism collapsed and capitalism emerged as the synthesis. Under capitalism, private ownership increased, factories and industry expanded. Then, the wage labor replaced serfdom. Marx believed capitalism itself also developed contradiction, especially between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat or working class. This example is important because it shows Marx's main idea. Historical change happened because contradictions in economy and social system create conflict and eventually produce a new social order. Finally, these slides explain contradiction and class struggle in capitalism. Marx believed every society contains contradiction. In capitalist society, the main contradiction exists between two classes: the bourgeoisie, who own factories, business, and capital, and the proletariat, who sell their labor to survive. The bourgeoisie aim to maximize profit, while workers seek for fair wage and better living conditions. Because their interests are different, conflict naturally develops. According to Marx, contradictions leads to several stages. The first stage is contradiction that exists within society. The second stage is conflict and resistance emerge. After that, economic and political crisis deepen. Then revolutionary change become possible. Finally, a new social system eventually replace the old one. Marx believed history developed through this cycle of contradiction and struggles. This historical development can be seen in the transition from primitive communism to slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and potentially socialism or communism in the future. So, overall, Marx believed that social and economic conflicts is the engine that drive historical change. In conclusion, Hegel believed history developed through the conflict of ideas, while Marx transformed it into dialectical materialism, where material condition and class struggle drive social change. Marx used Hegel's dialectical method but shift the focus from idea to economic reality. Their theory became highly influential in philosophy, sociology, political science, and economics, and they continue to shape discussion about society and inequality today.
So in this part, I will explain how Marx's idea of social evolutions is related to Darwin's theory of natural selection. So before we discuss much, let's first understand who Charles Robert Darwin is and what his key idea is. So Charles Robert Darwin was a naturalist who developed the theory of evolutions by natural selection. This diagram shows how Darwin's natural selections work step by step. First, Darwin said that individuals within the same species are not exactly the same. For example, some animals may be faster, stronger, or better at finding food than others. Second, resources in nature are limited, such as food, water, and space. So, individuals must compete to survive. Next, survival of the fittest. Here, fittest does not mean the strongest, but the one that is best adapted to the environment are more likely to survive. These survivors reproduce and pass their advantages to the next generation. This is called inheritance. Over many generations, these small advantages accumulate and the whole species gradually changes. So evolution does not happen suddenly, but gradually over a long period of time. For example, if faster animals survive predators, over time, more and more animals will become fast. However, Darwin focused only on biological evolutions, not on human society. This idea of gradual change through competitions later influenced how much understood social and economic change. Now, I will explain how Marx adapted Darwin's idea and applied it to society. Marx read Darwin's book in 1860 and saw parallel in it with his own thinking and political economy. Marx saw a strong similarity between biological evolutions and social development. In Darwin theory, species evolve through competitions and survival. Similarly, Marx believed that society also changes through conflict and struggle. Now let's look at how the idea of Darwin and Marx are similar. First, both Darwin and Marx believe that change happens over time. Darwin explained how species gradually evolve, while Marx explained how society developed from one system to another. Second, both theories involve competitions. In Darwin theory,
organisms compete for survival. In match theory, social classes compete for power and resources. Third, both involve a form of selection. In nature, the fittest survive. In society, the dominant classes control the system. Much even said that Darwin theory provided a natural history basis for understanding class struggle. So for Marx, society does not stay the same. It evolved from one system to another, such as from feudalism to capitalism. This change happened because of conflict between different social classes. However, Marx did not fully agree with Darwin. In Darwin theory, evolution is natural and unconscious, but in Marx theory, humans can think, act, and even create revolutions. So Darwin explained natural selections while Marx explained social revolutions. Marx borrowed the idea of evolutions from Darwin but applied it to society, where change is driven by class struggle instead of natural selection. If Darwin theory is about animals competing to survive, Marx theory is about social classes competing to control the system. That's all for my part on Darwin and Marx. I will now pass to the next member to continue.
Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. My name is Siti Nur Alia Balkis bin Tramilis and my metric number is 306322. And for my part, I will be covering Marx's full theory of history, which he called history materialism. However, Marx did not develop this theory entirely on his own. He was heavily influenced by three thinkers who came before him. Those three are Ludwig Feuerbach, George Wilhelm Hegel, and Charles Darwin. Each of them contributed an essential foundation to Marx's theory. In a moment, I will explain what those foundations are, and then I will show you how Marx put them all together into one unified theory of history. Before we understand Marx, we need to understand the three ideas he borrowed and transformed. The first comes from Ludwig Feuerbach, and it is called philosophical materialism. Feuerbach's core argument was a simple but revolutionary, which is the material world is what is real. Everything begins with the physical, tangible world around us. Consciousness, ideas, beliefs, religion. These things do not create reality. It is the other way around. Reality creates consciousness. Marx took this idea seriously and made it in the foundation of his entire theory. The second influence is George Wilhelm Hegel, who gave Marx the dialectical process. Hegel believed that history moves forward through contradiction. He described it in three stages. First, you have the thesis, which is the existing state of things. Then comes the antithesis, which is a force or idea that contradicts and challenges the thesis. The clash between these two produces a synthesis, something new that resolves the contradiction. Then that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the cycle begins again. But here is a crucial difference between Hegel and Marx. For Hegel, this dialectical movement was a movement of ideas and spirit, something happening in the realm of thoughts. Marx looked at this and said, no, this is happening in the material world. In the economy, in class relationships, Marx said he took Hegel and turned him right side up. The third influence is Charles Darwin, who showed the world that species evolve through competition and natural selection. The strongest survive, the weakest are eliminated, and this process drives changes over time. Marx applied this same logic to human society. Instead of animals competing for survival, you have social classes competing for power and resources. And just like in nature, the outcome of that struggle determines the shape of society going forward. When you put all three of these together, Feuerbach's materialism, Hegel's dialectical, and Darwin's concept of struggle, you get historical materialism. Now, we come to the core framework of Marx's theory, which is perhaps the most important concept shown in this slide, which is the distinction between the base and the superstructure. Marx argued that every society can be understood in two layers. The bottom layer is the base, and this is the economic foundation of society. The base is made up of three things. The first is what Marx called the force of production. These are the physical and human resources used to produce things, including tools, machine, technology, land, also the skill and labor of workers. Simply put, the forces of production are the how of making things in a given society. The second part of the base in the relationships of production. These are the social and property relations that exist between people in the process of production. Who owns the land? Who owns the factory? Who is forced to work for whom? In ancient Rome, you had the master and the slave. In medieval Europe, you had the lord and the serf. In modern capitalism, you have the capitalist and worker. These are all examples of relations of production. Now, above the base sits the superstructure. The superstructure includes everything else, which is the legal system, the political system, religion, art, philosophy, literature, and even the structure of families. Everything that we tend to think of as culture or idea. Marx's central and most controversial claim is this, which is the base, determines the superstructure. The economy shapes everything else. The laws of society, the religion of society, the art and values of a society. All of this reflect and serve the economic interests of the ruling class. When the economic foundation changes, eventually the entire superstructure changes with it. But there is a tension built into the system, and that tension is what drives history forward. The forces of production are dynamic. Technology improves, new industry develop, the skills of workers advance. The relations of property are static. Property rules, class hierarchies, and legal system resist change. They are comfortable for the ruling class and are actively reinforced by the superstructure through religion, law, and political ideology. This tension leads us directly to Marx's most famous statement. He wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." In simple terms, you do not think your way into a new society. The material and economic conditions change first, and the ideas follows. So, now the question is, what happens when those dynamic forces of production grow so much that the static relations of production can no longer contain them? That is when contradiction emerge, and that contradiction is the engine of historical changes. Marx described this process using the same dialectical structure he borrowed from Hegel, but now applied to real economic history. The first stage is the thesis. This is the existing order. The relations of production are in place. There are property laws, class hierarchies, and a superstructure of religion and government that all work together to preserve the existing social order and make it feel natural and permanent. The second stage is the antithesis. The forces of production keep developing. New technologies emerge, new industries grow, new classes of people arise with new economic interests. The existing relations of production start to feel outdated and restrictive. The third stage is conflict. Eventually, the gap between the dynamic forces and the static relations become too great. The old relations of production no longer serve development because they obstruct it. Marx used a very powerful word here. He called the old relation fetters, which means chains or restraints. At this point, class struggle erupts. The class that benefits from the new forces of production rises up against the class that controls the old relation. The first stage is synthesis. Revolution occurs. The old order is overthrown. New relations of production are established that are aligned with the current forces of production, and society can once again move forward and develop. But this new synthesis becomes the next thesis, and the entire cycle begins again at a higher level. The key insight here, which is explained at the bottom of this slide, is that, for Marx, history does not change because great leaders think new thoughts, or because philosophers write new books. History changes because material contradictions in the economy reach a breaking point, and the oppressed class has no choice but to revolt. the idea come after the economics, not before. Marx then used this framework to map out the entire sweep of human history. He identified 5 major stages, which he called modes of production. Each one emerged from the contradictions of the one before it, and each one eventually produces the conditions that destroy it. The first stage is primitive communism. This is the earliest form of human society, before classes existed. People lived in small communities, held land in common ownership, and cooperated to survive. There was no exploitation, no surplus, and no class of struggle. Because the level of productivity was so low that workers could barely produce enough to feed themselves. You cannot exploit someone if they are already working at the absolute limit of survival. An example Marx had in mind was Native American societies before European colonization. But gradually, as tools improved and agriculture developed, productivity rose. Workers began producing more than they need to survive. The extra output is what Marx called a surplus. And the moment a surplus exists, exploitation becomes possible and profitable. This is what gave rise to the second stage, which is slavery. Under slavery, the master and slave relationships defines the whole of society. The exploitation is total and visible. The slave appears to receive nothing at all for their labor, even though they are of course fed and housed at a subsistence level. The problem is that slaves have almost no motivation to work well, and across history, slave revolts shook Asian civilizations from within until the system collapsed. The third stage is feudalism, which Marx found particularly interesting because the exploitation here is the most transparent of any system. The serf is allowed to farm a small plot of land for their own survival, but they are obligated to spend several days each week working on the lord's land for free. Everyone can see exactly how much is being taken. Serfs had more incentive than slaves because they had their own land to take care of, and feudalism allowed a high level of society development. But eventually, the growth of trades, towns, and the merchant class created forces that feudal property relations could not contain. The fourth stage is capitalism, and this is the one Marx analyzed most deeply and most passionately. Under capitalism, the exploiting class is the bourgeois, who owns the means of production, and the exploited class is the proletariat, the workers. What makes capitalism unique and that the exploitation is hidden, workers appear to be freely and fully paid for their labor. But Marx argued that workers are only paid enough to reproduce their labor power, meaning to survive and come back to work tomorrow. The rest of the value they create is taken by the capitalists as profit, what Marx called surplus value. Marx believed capitalism would eventually destroy itself. As competition intensified, capital would become increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. Workers would be driven into greater poverty and misery, and eventually the working class would organize, rise up, overthrow, and the bourgeois state, and establish what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional socialist society where the means of production are publicly owned. The fifth and final stage is socialism leading to communism. Under socialism, private ownership of capital is abolished. Production is planned for the collective good rather than private profit. Over time, as class distinctions disappear and the state loses its reason to exist as an instrument of class domination, it gradually withers away. What remains is pure communism, a classless, stateless society in which people contribute according to their ability and receive according to their need. As you can see in the table of the slide, each mode carries within it the contradictions that eventually destroys it. Each one is both a step forward in human development and the seed of the next revolution. So, let us bring everything together. Marx took three powerful ideas from three different thinkers. From Feuerbach, he took the idea that material conditions are the foundation of all humans' life and thoughts. From Hegel, he took the dialectical process, the idea that history moves through contradiction and conflict to resolutions. And from Darwin, he took the concept of struggle and survival as the force of drive changes. He combined this into a single grand theory of history. Society is built on an economic base, made up of forces and relations of production. Everything else, law, politics, religion, culture, is a superstructure that reflects and serves that base. When the dynamic forces of production outgrow the static relations of production, contradictions build up. Class struggles break out, and revolutions create a new mode of production. This process has already moved humanity through primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. And according to Marx, it will inevitably move us towards socialism and eventually communism. History, for Marx, is not random. It is not driven by the will of kings or the genius of philosophers. It follows a material logic rooted in the economy, driven by contradictions, and propelled by class struggle. And I will end with the words Marx himself wrote, which I think capture his entire worldview into a sentence. He said, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Thank you.
After covering all of the content, and here's come the summary. We have learned that the Marx rejected the old explanation of history, which is the great leaders, God's plan or ideas. He said, look at the material conditions. Society is built on an economic base which refer to the forces and relations of production. That base determines the superstructure such as law, religion, politics, and culture. When the dynamic forces of production outgrow the static relation of production, contradiction builds, class struggle erupts, revolution creates a new mode of production. That process has moved humanity through primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, and according to Marx, it towards socialism and communism. So after all of the theory, why are we still talking about Marx? Look at the problem he saw then. Factory owners own everything, but workers own nothing. Workers created the wealth, but the owners took the profit. Now look at today. Amazon, Google, big companies are owned by a tiny group of shareholders and CEOs. The warehouse workers, gig drivers, and coders create the value, but they own almost nothing. Many workers today still need multiple jobs to survive. So Marx was wrong about the revolution, but his question, why does the system work this way, is still unanswered. And that is why he still matters.